The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Episode 627. I will be, in a moment, speaking with David-Faris. He is the author of It's Time to Fight Dirty, and it is the perfect juxtaposition to this conversation, rather, is the perfect juxtaposition to everything that I've talked about so far this week, particularly, but for the longest, this asymmetrical fight that we've been in. Republicans are fighting dirty. Republicans are playing for keeps. Republicans are in a perpetual position of opposition. That is their default position. I mean, that's it. You can determine exactly what the Republican Party is going to do by what the Democratic Party is trying to get done. Whatever the Democratic Party tries to get done, even if it's passing legislation that is conservative legislation, Republicans are playing a scorch-earth game, and they are trying, and they're winning. And so this conversation, let's just get straight to the conversation with David-Faris, because I believe he has outlined the game plan. And this is what we need to be fighting for. These need to be our policy recommendations. And we need to hold the line here. He just a quick summary. He says that we need to pack the courts. Democrats, when they get back in power, they need to pack the courts to bring some balance to it. We need to give statehood to Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. We need to enact pass a Voting Rights Act that does away with all voter registration, that makes voter registration automatic, that does away with all voter ID laws, is what I meant to say, as well as re-enfranchises all anyone who spent time in jail. You know, those are just a few of the policy recommendations that he has. And so take a listen in. I think his demeanor he's very mild mannered, but what he's calling for is the exact type of bare knuckles fight that we need. Joining me now is David-Faris. He's the author of It's Time to Fight Dirty. He's also the author of Dissent and Revolution in a Digital Age, Social Media, Blogging, and Activism in Egypt. He is a regular contributor to The Week. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania and is an associate professor of political science at Roosevelt University in Chicago. David, how are you today?
I'm great. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much. Listen, I as soon as I saw your video, I told my audience to your video for C-SPAN. You were talking about your book, It's Time to Fight Dirty. I told my audience immediately to go read the book, and I let them know that I was going to have you on. You've outlined exactly from a procedural kind of structural fix to our problems, what I've been talking about for the longest on my podcast. I've focused mainly on the rhetoric and the political spin and how do we fight back against this asymmetrical fight. But in your book, you outline very practical, well, they are practical to me. Some people will think that they're extreme, but you laid out steps of how we can fix this broken system and to counterbalance what the Republican Party is doing. Before we get into the details of it, can you give me a snapshot of what's in the book?
Sure. I mean, so some of these proposals are more practical than others, but the book starts from the premise that the left is starting from a major disadvantage during every national election that we have in the United States, and including also many state elections too. So there's a bunch of things that are built into the Constitution that are now tilted against Democrats. Like one of them is the structure of the Senate, and there are some things that Republicans have done sort of actively to tilt the playing field towards them and against the left, against Democrats. So the book looks at different ways that you can approach these problems and offers a series of solutions, all of which would just require the passage of a law by a Democratic Congress and signature by a Democratic president, rather than amending the Constitution, which is like virtually impossible at this point.
Right.
So it takes all of these problems, gerrymandering, structure of the Senate, the horrible problem of the Supreme Court, like voter suppression. It looks at all these things and says, hey, there's actually something we can do about this. All it takes is a simple law passed by Congress, and we can really address some of the ways that Democrats often lose elections that they won or that they should have won based on some of these roadblocks.
And in the book, you cover some new and transparent voting systems that could end partisan corruption, the elimination of age-old and unquestioned tactics like filibustering, longer terms for representatives. That's something that I've been advocating for. Bolstering the Senate with more Democrats by granting statehood. This is where we get into more of the radical solutions that I actually love. But I just want to give the context for the audience. Statehood to Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., and dividing California into 7 separate states. And the last one is restructuring the Supreme Court to lessen the burden of the bench, as well as creating more court appointees to adequately defend the American people and give all Americans a fair and timely trial. So you have it's about 6 steps that are increase in intensity. But they each of them actually address a structural problem. Of those, just give me like a snapshot of the ones that you feel are the most practical in terms of accomplishing, as you described in your last interview, on day one when Democrats get power back.
Sure. So there's a couple of ideas in here that there was really like nothing stopping us from doing this. And so the statehood for DC and Puerto Rico, I think, is the easiest thing on this entire list to do. DC has had a referendum. It's very clear the people of the district want statehood. They have no voting representation in Congress whatsoever. It's outrageous. And it's like partisan hardball. DC would send 2 Democratic senators to Washington. It would send a Democratic member of the House. And there's no reason not to do it. And that could be accomplished, we all know nothing happens on day one, but let's say month 1, right? Right. This could happen in the first month of the next Democratic administration. And ditto for Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is also a U.S. territory, has no voting representation in Congress. I think you see the consequences of that after Hurricane Maria, where it's like no one in D.C. has to answer to the people of Puerto Rico, and thus they get neglected. And the victims of the sort of racist neglect that we saw in the hurricane response. I think there's a slight complication with Puerto Rico in that there was a referendum last year, but I think too many people boycotted it. Statehood won, but there's like multiple options for Puerto Rico, so that they need to get creative with the referendum to produce a majority for something. And I'd like to see another referendum before granting statehood to Puerto Rico, because I think it's necessary for legitimacy of that project. Right. But Puerto Rico would also send 2 Democratic senators to D.C. almost certainly, and it may send 7 Democrats to the House, right? So that's a big lift for us. Right. And it's also it's like the right thing to do. I like to tell people if DC and Puerto Rico were states right now, almost certainly Democrats would already hold the Senate, and we could block Brett Kavanaugh. We could really investigate the president. We could have been doing this for a year, since the special election in Alabama. So it really would have been a transformative thing for this to have already been done. And it's really just an act of Congress signed by the president, and then we have these 2 new states.
So let me take a step back and frame this conversation a little more for the audience. And actually, I want to use your words to frame it. You said that we are playing, we have to play hardball. That's the first line. But you described it as we have to smash and humiliate the current Republican Party to bring things back into equilibrium. So the things that you're suggesting, while they are going to seem extreme to, let's say, my more right-leaning side of my audience, you're not playing games here. You're saying it in a very measured tone. Very, you're not going to be as bombastic as I am, but what you're saying is like cutting to the core of how we smash this coalition that you said, really kind of can be traced back to Newt-Gingrich's, his scorch-earth policies. So I want to set that frame for this conversation, because everything that you're saying is in a sense radical, but we're dealing with radical times and unreasonable people. I always say on the show that you can't be reasonable with unreasonable people. So let me now we have the frame, let me toss it back to the question of why wouldn't we be doing this already? What is the problem with the current Democratic leadership that stops them from realizing what we're truly up against with this Newt-Gingrich styled Republican Party?
Well, I mean, I think up until recently there were 2 problems, right? One is that the Democrats, I think, historically have been more committed to the idea of like a pragmatic, sort of bipartisan deal-making politics than the contemporary Republican Party has. And that, I think, has led them to think again and again mistakenly that Republicans will meet them halfway on policy, if we're just nice enough about it, or if we ask, or if we just wait around for it to happen. The other problem, I think, is not just with Democrats in Congress. I think it's like the entire left. I think that we believe that the right policy and the right message will deliver us victory in election after election after election. And one of the things that I really try to emphasize in the book is that you can have all the right policies. You can win the election, but you will still lose, either because of the electoral decision rules or the way the districts are drawn or whatever, or the Senate, So it's really, I feel like we've already won a lot of these policy fights. Hillary Clinton got more votes. Democratic senators got more votes in 2016. Democratic members of the House got more votes in 2012. And in all three cases, we lost those races. And the reason that we lost those races, maybe it's some policy, maybe it's some messaging, but it's also these really important institutional problems that are bigger than any Democratic majority. They're bigger than any single election or any single fight. They're things that are a problem for us in every single election that we run in. And so I think that, it's begun to dawn on us that this is a problem. Like when we talk about taking back the House in November, people are like, well, we have to win it. We have to win it by like 5 or 10%. And we're all like, okay, yeah, of course we have to win by 10% to win. Right. And I think I think a lot of people are stepping back and asking like, why do we have to win the election by 10% to actually win the election? Like, that's kind of correct. So, we need to think about how to address those problems. Like, the end of this book, I would love to see the Republican coalition smashed. I think it's really, really important that we win the next two elections big, to send a message that the kind of open, sort of racist, white nationalist politics that we see every day on our screens is not acceptable to the vast majority of American people. But it's also about what we do with that smashing. Like, what do we do with the pieces that we've smashed?
Right.
If we go on with business as usual, I think that it's just going to be another cycle of, we make some policies, then there's a backlash, and then Republicans are right back into power, because we haven't fixed the underlying structural obstacles to a long-lasting progressive majority in this country, which is what I think we need to bring the United States into line with the other advanced democracies, where there's more social equality,
right.
There's more community spirit, and you're not going to be ruined by a trip to the ER or whatever.
Right.
Name one of 50 problems with our democracy right now.
Right.
I think they're not going to get fixed unless we're in power for some time.
I want you to be patient with me as I frame this next question, because I have to piece it together. Joe Lieberman put out an op-ed. I forgot if it was Washington Post or the New York Times. I forget which outlet, but basically saying that electing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York is a problem, and it will stop us from ending the fighting in Congress. And I'm like, obviously he hasn't read your book, but obviously he's not paying attention, because the fighting pre-existed her and it's going to exist after her. But to me, it represents the kind of thinking that is at the core problem of the Democratic leadership right now. So it's kind of the same question that I asked before, just in a different way. Do you think that we can accomplish any of the things in your book with the current leadership that we have if they carry the similar type of thinking as Joe Lieberman?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to your question is no. I mean, I think that we need change in party leadership. I mean, I think it's really convenient for Joe Lieberman, who was in Congress forever, who was a Democratic nominee for vice president, and then who defected to the other side, to blame this one candidate for Congress in this one district in New York for the problems of Congress. Like, oh my God, like, get over yourself. Joe Lieberman is a dinosaur. He represents no one but himself, and no one cares about him. That's why he had to run that op-ed on the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, it was the Wall Street Journal. Okay, it was one of them.
Yeah. It's like no credible liberal outlet would give him the space to spew nonsense like that. I mean, I think the broader issue is that it feels to me like Chuck Schumer in particular is waiting for this long gone universe of like bipartisan, like lunches with your Republican colleagues,
right?
And, business as usual, like the norm based universe that he sort of came into power in. He's waiting for that to come back desperately yearns for it to come back, right? Like if they just say the right things to their Republican colleagues, eventually, like Bob Corker and Jeff Flake or whoever will lead this like counter revolution against the Trumpists, and then And then in 2021, DC will go back to being the way that like it was, and that's just hopelessly sad and desperate. And he doesn't say it out loud, but you can see his reactions to all of these crises are suffused with this instinct for compromise, this yearning for the past, and the past is gone. And so if Chuck Schumer doesn't recognize that and can't lead the party into a future where we're going to be having these sort of hard knuckle battles over and over again. If he's not that guy, then he's not that guy. And I'd like to see him replaced by somebody who really understands the fight. And that's like, I don't dislike Chuck Schumer. I don't think he's like a bad guy. I just don't think that he understands
the lay of the land right now.
Yeah, like the new parameters of these politics are not, go out after Trump's Helsinki summit and say like, well, this is something Republicans have to deal with. It's like, no, man, like, what do you think we should do? Like, why aren't you in front of the cameras every day demanding the tax returns, like following the paper trail, like talking about Mueller? It's not enough. What he's doing is not enough. And it's not because he's a bad person. It's because I think that he's sort of trapped in a DC, in his mind,
you're right.
A DC bipartisan paradise that's just gone, man. That place is gone.
And I think, I mean, this happened. You traced it back to Newt-Gingrich, 1994 when he took power. I mean, this has been the lay of the land for a little while. I mean, and by little, I mean 20 plus years, and they still haven't come to the realization. I mean, Barack Obama, to me, as much as I liked him and still fond of him, he was a part of the same problem. He went to DC with the idea of working with people who had already intended in their mind to, no matter what he did, it didn't matter if it was Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton that year. No matter what a Democrat was going to do, they were going to oppose it, even if that meant betraying their beliefs, betraying their own health care bill, because as we know, this Obamacare is actually Romney care. They did not care what a Democrat offered. They were going to oppose them. And we're really behind the 8 ball here, right? We're 20 years behind the curve, or 24 years now behind the curve of what Republicans have been doing. I once heard Rush Limbaugh put it like this. He referred to everyone on the left, everyone from neoliberals all the way to Marxist-Leninists, as navel gazers. And to me, I think that they understood this about us so long ago, and they weaponized our self-reflection. They recognized our desire for cooperation and bipartisanship, and they weaponized that against us. But you said something in a previous interview. You said you referenced two political scientists, Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein, and they referred to this as asymmetric polarization. It was funny when I heard you say that because I always refer to it on my show as asymmetrical political warfare. It's out of balance. It's out of whack. And if we don't have the right people to fight this, we're never going to win. Can you describe it more from the political science perspective, this asymmetric polarization?
Yeah, sure. So there's a project at UCLA that tracks the voting records of members of Congress going back to the 19th century, and using some statistical innovation, it assigns an ideological score to every member of Congress on a dimension from like -1 is perfectly liberal, perfectly progressive like Bernie Sanders, or to the left of Bernie Sanders, right? And +1 is like perfectly conservative, like Mike Lee, Ted Cruz type of Republican. And they've been running these numbers for a long time. And what they found is that starting in 1980, the Republican Party, the sort of ideological center of the Republican Party in Congress, started marching off to the right very rapidly. So that by 2010 or so, Republicans were twice as conservative as they were in 1980, whereas the Democrats had barely budged. The Democrats were like basically in the same ideological space that they had been in the early 1980s. I mean, anecdotally, even that doesn't make sense to me, right? Because the Democrats of 2010 felt a little bit more conservative to me than like the Monmouth Democrats. But I think that I think that doesn't take into account like some movement on social issues, right? That also factor into this. So Democrats had stayed the same, and Republicans have become this very rigid, very narrow ideological party. And that's why they call it asymmetric, because the changes that took place in American politics, where Republicans were really radicalized ideologically, starting with Ronald Reagan, this didn't happen to Democrats, arguably until like the last couple of years. And I do think that new data will show that the Democrats have become more progressive. That the average Democrat in Congress is becoming more progressive than they were, 10 or even 5 years ago. But what that has meant is that you have one side of Congress that's like a sort of heterodox assembly of people, like everyone from Joe Manchin to Bernie Sanders, and they're like, they're still looking for deal making. They're still open to working with Trump. I mean, even after Trump's election, Schumer and Pelosi went out there and they were like, well, I mean, if he puts an infrastructure bill in front of us, like, we'll have to talk, we'll have to think about it. Right. And if Trump had been a more clever person, instead of just like a galloping fool, he would have done stuff like this, right? Like he could have easily have split the Democratic coalition on things like infrastructure, on things like healthcare, and even on things like immigration. But he basically just subcontracted his entire agenda to the Heritage Foundation and to the far right.
Right.
And he hasn't been able to come back from that. And his decision to do that, I think, has hardened some movement on the Democratic side. Whereas, 5 years ago, it was like, what's your position on healthcare? And it's everything from like, the ACA is fine as it is to like, we should have a public option to Medicare for all. Whereas I think we're now moving in the direction where Medicare for all is like the default position of the Democratic Party. And if you don't hold it, you're not like thrown out of the party, but you don't have national standing anymore. Right. And that's, I think, what's happened on the Republican side is like, there's, it's not like they all have the same ideas about everything, but it's like, if you open your mouth and say like, I think that we should maybe close a tax loophole on this, produce like $5 in additional revenue. It's like, you're out. Right. Like you can still be in the Republican Party, but you can't be a national figure anymore. Right. You're done. And so the sort of the long-term consequences of that is that I feel like Democrats have been behind in these policy fights because they keep, they hang around waiting for compromise that never comes. I think we saw that in 2013 when Obama was still doing the grand bargain negotiations with Boehner. And I think it was in 2013 where I think Obama finally realized, like, these guys are not going to work with me, ever. Doesn't matter what I offer them. Like, I offered to raise the retirement age for Social Security. It's like, like a decades-long Republican goal. And they were like, no, there's no taxes in here. We can't do this. So, as much as I don't think our political system is built for this kind of thing, I also don't think Democrats can continue to play a different game than Republicans. Like, I think that we have to get smart about this. I think that we have to get tighter ideologically. And I think that we need to be willing to fight harder, even fight harder than the Democrats in Congress are fighting right now. I mean, I'm proud of some of the things that the Democrats did over the last 2 years. Like they stopped the healthcare thing. Right. That was a huge win, but it felt different this year. Like, why did 17 Democrats vote for the Dodd-Frank rollback? Like, that was just nuts. Right. So it's stuff like that where you see like this old sort of like bipartisanism creeping back into the caucus in ways that I think were not helpful. And now that we're unified again against Kavanaugh, lo and behold, our poll numbers are back up again. So to me, it's just like unavoidable conclusion. You have to play this kind of hardball in contemporary American politics.
You have to play this type of hardball in contemporary American politics. I'm going to tweet that out exactly like that. We spoke for about another 20 minutes, and we covered everything from the lesser evils to more about bipartisanship and the decisions that Democrats are making that undermines their own political future. They try to save their political future by triangulating, but it actually backfires. So we talked about that in great detail. There's 20 more minutes. Go to patreon.com/the BPD show to get the full interview. And actually, more important than the rest of the interview, I do want you to go get the rest of the interview, but go get the book. Go get the book. It's time to fight dirty and read it for yourself. Because like I said, this is the playbook. This is what we need to do. This is where we draw the line. We don't let them go any further. We draw the line here and we let them know that we're going to fight as dirty as they have been fighting for 24 years. Go get the book and then go listen to the rest of the podcast at patreon.com/the BPD show.